So I'm standing at Johnson Hall in current day Johnstown, New York. This was the home of William Johnson, the first Baronet of New York and the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British Empire in New York State, what became New York State. In the 1750s and 1760s. Johnson comes here being granted 50,000 acres of land and builds this structure in 1758 to serve as a storehouse and as well as a defensive place, and then another building similar to it across the way. These buildings are the first ones built in 1758. This one is a modern reproduction. This one is an original to the site. Then in 1763, he builds this more formal Georgian mansion, very much in the style of places like Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in Virginia. The front of it here is being renovated and restored right now in the Georgian style with a central hall, interior parlors. It's a really great museum filled with all kinds of fantastic artifacts set up to show like how grand a place this would have been for Johnson to not only administer his lands, his tenants, the people working his gardens and his fields, as well as visiting dignitaries like governors and generals and traders that would come through and stay for days, weeks, or even months at a time. He would hold council with the local Haudenosaunee nations here, and going so far as I believe it was his third wife, is a woman by the name of Molly Brant, who is the sibling of Joseph Brant, who is a prominent Indian Mohawk leader who will be a key part of the American Revolution story. Other interesting bits of the story here, not only were there indentured servants, but like any British lord or prominent British person of that era, New York State was a slave state until 1827. It was the largest slave state north of Maryland. All of the signers of the Declaration of Independence from New York State were slave owners or figured into the slave trade, and he had up to 30 or 40 African slaves living here, many of them in this building, as well as some down the way, more where the gardens and fields were. So they do a pretty good job of acknowledging the enslaved workers, also the indentured workers who were residents here along with Johnson and his family. Johnson is a hero of the Battle of Lake George. He's at the Battle of Crillon near Fort Ticonderoga. He's wounded at Fort George at the Battle of Lake George with a musket ball in his hip, which he lives on and dies in 1774 with the house going to his son, who remains a loyalist to the British and eventually has to escape to Canada in 1776 when some New Jersey Continentals show up and seize the property on behalf of the Continental Army. So for a home in the of that like mid to late 1700s period, it's really a grand example that you can find here in upstate New York, and it's well worth a visit.